Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. One of the questions many fans have been asking in the wake of the loss by Anthony Joshua to Oleksandr Uysk is what could Joshua do different in a rematch? So Joshua's promoter Eddie Hearn is talking about a potential rematch in the UK in February or March. So that's about, 5 or 6 months away, something there or thereabouts. And given both fighters had long camps, grueling camps, and had been training for much of the year for this fight, they will want to have some time off now before getting back into camp, probably in the new year. But Joshua, in his post-fight interview, spoke about going away, picking himself up, and coming again, that he wouldn't be getting down in the dumps, and he would be looking to strategize to come back and reclaim his titles, become a 3-time heavyweight champion. And I know a lot of people have just after that fight, which you saw a great performance by Oleksandr Uysk. Truly very good boxing performance. He was able to use his speed and movement to flummox Anthony Joshua in many rounds. That speed and quickness and the general, caliber of his footwork, it was something Joshua just really couldn't sort of solve. He seemed to be waiting for the right opportunities, the right spots, the right punches, and sometimes they just never came. Waited too long. Didn't probably throw enough punches, but there's been a number of fans who've sort of said what he should be doing for the next fight. And I thought, well, I'll weigh on some of those sort of comments and discuss some of those and drop some of my own thoughts on those. So one of those who's weighed in on what Joshua is doing, or rather isn't doing, is George Foreman, the former heavyweight champion. So see here on screen a few different posts from Foreman. So he's saying Joshua has the future, lots of ability, but he's got to learn to push his own button. Some corners are just waiting on their fees while we push our own destiny. Also another one, AJ just seems confused. I've been there. Too many in his ear. Make up your mind and be yourself. A puncher. And I'll definitely come back to that one. George Foreman says, saw the Joshua Usyk fight. AJ seemed afraid. Has he lost his identity? Should I be cautious? Go 12. Attack with my power. Usyk, typical southpaw. If you won't hit me, I'll award and hit you. Something's wrong. Not the AJ. He took his punishment. Who are you, AJ? Some interesting comments there, because obviously Foreman is saying that Joshua needs to be who he was earlier in his career. A guy that was noted for his power, his knockouts. He was seen as a puncher. And I know some people will point to the Andy Ruiz Jr. fight, the first one, and say that changed him, that after that he became something different. But I would disagree with that, because even prior to the Ruiz Jr. fight, we saw different versions of Joshua on different nights. I think the version against Vladimir Klitschko was very different to the version that fought Joseph Parker. And the Parker and Usyk fights, they're not too dissimilar. Because Joseph Parker tried to use, speed and movement against Joshua there. He just wasn't aggressive enough. Plus, also, when he did get to the inside, he had a referee that was actually sort of stopping his work. Although, it's got to be noted, Parker's not a great inside fighter. So much is often made about Parker was refused the opportunity to work on the inside, but often he doesn't do much on the inside when he gets there. But I would say those fights are not too dissimilar. Calm, also Alexander Povetkin, they have had some success as well. And we always say styles make fights, but when someone gets beaten, it's like we sort of forget that. Some styles are just harder for some boxers. And what you had in Oleksandr Uysk was something that Anthony Joshua hadn't really seen much before in a southpaw, but also someone who was constantly moving, also pressuring. I mean, Usyk was basically standing right in front of him for most of the night, using head movement, using angles. He was able to get to the inside, and he was having a lot of success. And Anthony Joshua was trying to counter and combat that, but just really having a lot of issues. And this is the thing. So going back to some of George Foreman's comments, I mean, asking who he is. And I think what we've seen from Joshua, especially in the last couple of years, is he's been tailoring his approach to the opponent. But just because it didn't work this time doesn't mean that he's not a good fighter, that he can't come up with a strategy to have more success against Oleksandr Usyk in a rematch. I think we saw in that fight, there were rounds where Joshua did win. He did take some rounds off Oleksandr Usyk, but also other rounds where he was working in a lot of body shots. And that was something like Usyk was, often gesturing that he was hit low, but some of the body shots were fair and legitimate shots. It was clear Oleksandr Usyk didn't like some of the work to the body. And I'm sure that's something that Joshua and his team have been looking at. And I've seen a lot of people sort of saying Joshua needs to fire Robert McCracken, he needs to get a new team, all that sort of stuff. I think that's sort of an overreaction, and often this is what happens in a loss. I think we have to remember, after that Ruiz fight, people were saying that Joshua was done, that the rematch would end worse than the first fight, and sometimes that does happen. But what we saw was him go away, put in the work, and do something different in the rematch. And I know some people will say, well, look, Andy Ruiz turned up out of shape in that rematch. But I think, he's going to have a good 6 months to plan, strategize, and prepare. So I don't think we can just write him off. I think that would be dangerous to do so. People who do that at his peril, at their peril. He was still able to have some success in that fight, just not enough. And Oleksandr Usyk, he will also have that same 6 months. So he will be looking to, obviously probably make a few tweaks of his own. There will be things that he wouldn't have been happy with and he'll look to do different. But what we saw from Oleksandr Usyk was a pretty typical Oleksandr Usyk type performance. But I think a lot of people did think they would see from Anthony Joshua more aggression, using the height and the reach a bit better than he did. I mean, when you consider, he was the bigger man with the, bigger reach by 4 or 5 inches, it wasn't a factor in the fight at all. So how can he make those advantages count in a rematch? Surely that's something that you've got to be able to work towards. Trying to keep Usyk out to some degree, because Usyk was just able to sort of get to the inside, almost no resistance. I mean, I think a lot of people expected Joshua was going to keep Usyk at the back of his jab for certain points in that fight. Wasn't able to do it very much at all. But one of the things that I've seen people saying, and I guess George Foreman, this is sort of coming back to that puncher thing. I've seen a lot of people saying he just needs to go in there, be aggressive and blast him out. And I know some people have been saying he can't do that because he's hiding glass. His chin is not great. If he goes in there, he could get stopped if he tries that sort of strategy. I actually don't think Joshua's chin is terrible, but I think what really is the bigger issue is the stamina. And I think that's one of the things that's been lost in the shuffle here with that fight. For me, in the way that Joshua was fighting in there and the way that he gassed later on in the fight, the stamina is the main issue. He's trying to pace himself, but against a guy who was showing constant movement, using, speed and angles, zipping in and out, being able to tag him, that mental pressure against a guy who was constantly right there in front of him. It wasn't that Usyk was just, marauding in from the outside. Usyk was right there in the pocket with him for large stretches. So, I mean, the stamina is the thing that I think is the real issue here for Joshua in terms of some of these strategies and these plans that he is implementing for his fights. How does he manage his energy to, one, be able to go 12, but 2, be able to step it up and not have to. I mean, we saw against Kubrat Pulev, for example, he went for a finish in the 3rd round. Pulev wasn't out of there by the 3rd round. It took Joshua some rounds to recover. And we saw in this fight with Usyk, he was fading badly at the end. And I think one of the things is that energy management, and that's going to dictate how he fights to some extent, because some people have been saying he needs to do a Chisora, come forward and just let his hands go. But let me tell you, if he does that in the rematch, probably what we're going to see is Joshua gassing out after about 2 or 3 rounds and then being taken out because he's completely spent. I don't think he can fight like that. I truly don't. But there is something to be said for what George Foreman is saying, that Joshua needs to have more of a puncher's mentality. But easier said than done when you've got a guy in front of you that basically is a moving target. This wasn't some sort of static target that he could just let his hands go and find the target. Usyk was making it very difficult to be hit. He's not unhittable, and we saw Joshua having a lot of success to the body at different spots later in the fight. But it's still easy to say he's a puncher and be aggressive and take his block off. But I think there is room for him to be more aggressive, use that height and the reach. But I think just things like using the clinch better, tying up. I mean, we didn't see much of that in this first fight. I don't think there was a clinch for the first 4 rounds. But when they were engaged in those sort of clinches, Usyk didn't look completely comfortable. And that should be a strategy for Joshua, to be trying to lean on his man, try to tire him out a little bit, press his 240 pounds on the smaller man. But easier said than done, just trying to sort of, you don't want to clinch for the sake of clinching. But when you are there, try to lay all over that man and, push him, back, put him on the ropes and, use those seconds to try tire him out something. But ultimately, it's going to be interesting to see how they approach this rematch, because they may not make massive tweaks. And some people will say, well, I think that would be a mistake. But when you consider he won at least 3 clear rounds, I think many people gave him 5, 6, and 8. There were some swing rounds as well, 4 and 9. It wasn't as wide as some people are making out. It was a very good fight. And those final rounds, obviously, Usyk pulled away. I think many people forget after about 8 rounds, a lot of people had it relatively close. Whether it was 5-3 or something like that, the fight was still in the balance. But clearly, Usyk, with the way that he was fighting, closed the show in style. So, there's a lot to sort of mull over for Joshua and his team. And I think just sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and firing them all would be a massive mistake. I know that George Foreman seems to think that he was confused too many people in his ear, but they were working to a strategy. They were working to a plan. It just didn't pan out. And sometimes that is boxing. You saw the better man on the night who was able to execute and implement his fight strategy better than the other guy. And I think for people to write Joshua off would be highly premature. But we've seen he's beatable. He tried to box with the boxer. It didn't work. He got outboxed and beaten. They've got to try something different. But given what we've seen in recent years, from the way that Joshua fights against guys like Parker, like Takam, guys who can move, come in and out, who need to come to the inside to get their work away, it might be more tweaks than rather wholesale change. And I'm not sure he can sort of fight the style that some people are saying he should implement, a more sort of balls to the wall strategy. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.